Please like and subscribe, and hit the bell notification if you like scary stories. Now to our story. This story is called Abyssal Shadows. Chapter 1, Abandoned Ship. The wind screamed like a banshee, a tortured wail that ripped through the rigging of the Mary Celeste, tearing at the canvas sails until they flapped like the wings of a wounded bird. Rain lashed down, a relentless barrage that stung the skin and blurred vision to a watery haze. Captain Elias Thorne, his weathered face etched with the lines of 1,000 storms, gripped the wheel, his knuckles white against the polished wood. He fought the helm with a grim determination, the ship bucking and groaning beneath him like a wounded beast. Beside him, Finn, the young deckhand, his face pale and drawn, clung to a stanchion, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He was barely old enough to shave, yet his youthful face reflected a resilience honed by years spent battling the unforgiving sea. He watched the waves, monstrous walls of churning water that threatened to swallow them whole, each one a potential death sentence. Below deck, the engineer Silas, a man whose cynicism was only matched by his skill, wrestled with a gushing pipe. The stench of seawater mixed with the acrid tang of diesel fuel filled the air, a suffocating cocktail that mirrored the growing despair in the cramped space. He cursed under his breath, the rhythmic clang of his wrenching tool a desperate counterpoint to the storm's relentless fury. The Mary Celeste, a sturdy vessel usually, was now a toy in the hands of a malevolent god. "She's taking on water fast, Captain," Finn shouted over the roar of the wind, his voice barely audible above the storm's cacophony. Salt spray stung his eyes, blurring the already chaotic scene. The deck tilted precariously to one side, threatening to send them all tumbling into the churning abyss. Thorne's jaw was clenched tight, his gaze fixed on the raging sea. The rhythmic pounding of the waves against the hull was a relentless drumbeat of impending doom. Each creak of the ship's timbers sent a fresh jolt of icy fear through him. He'd faced storms before, countless storms that tested the limits of his endurance, but this was different. This was a tempest unleashed from the very depths of hell. "Silas, report!" Thorne roared, his voice strained. He could barely hear his own words above the storm's fury. The ship groaned, a deep, shuddering groan that spoke of structural failure. "It's no use, Captain," Silas's voice echoed weakly from below. "We're losing the battle. The pumps can't keep up. We're going down." A wave, larger than any they had yet encountered, crashed over the deck, sweeping Finn to his knees, the force of the water knocking the breath from his lungs. Thorne fought to regain control of the wheel, his arms burning with the effort. This was it, the moment of truth, the final reckoning. Survival felt like a cruel joke, the laughter of a merciless god echoing through the storm. "Abandoned ship," Thorne bellowed, his voice raw with despair. The words hung in the air, swallowed almost immediately by the wind and the waves. It was a decision born of necessity, a desperate gamble against the odds. But it was their only hope. The chaos that followed was a blur of frantic activity. Life jackets were hastily donned, ropes were secured, and the small boats were lowered into the raging sea. Each step was taken with the awareness that it might be their last. The sea was a raging beast, and they were tiny morsels of flesh tossed around at its whim. The descent into the lifeboats was fraught with peril. Waves crashed over the sides, threatening to capsize their fragile vessels. Finn slipped, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the gunwale as he was thrown off balance by a particularly large wave. He managed to recover his footing, drenched to the bone, his heart hammering in his chest. Silas, his face grim, helped the captain into the largest of the lifeboats. They pushed off from the Mary Celeste, watching as their home, their refuge, slipped beneath the waves, vanishing beneath the churning water. As the Mary Celeste finally disappeared, swallowed by the merciless sea, a new terror emerged. In the distance, through the driving rain and the relentless waves, loomed a vast decaying cruise liner, a ghostly behemoth that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of the storm. It was a derelict vessel, a graveyard of rust and decay, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the tumultuous sky. It was a macabre monument to disaster, a sinister beacon in the heart of the tempest. Its dark, empty windows stared out like vacant eyes, the broken glass glinting eerily in the flashes of lightning. Yet, in that moment of utter despair, it offered a flicker of hope, a desperate, almost impossible chance of survival. The decision was instant, primal, to reach the ship, whatever the cost. The fear of the unknown was replaced by the immediate terror of the storm. Perhaps the looming derelict held less danger. The journey to the derelict liner was a harrowing one. The lifeboat was tossed about like a leaf in a hurricane, each wave threatening to send them tumbling into the unforgiving depths. The relentless rain continued its onslaught, obscuring their vision, the wind howling in their ears like a chorus of tormented spirits. They were at the mercy of the storm, clinging to life with every fiber of their being. As they finally reached the liner, they were met with a chilling silence. The storm's fury seemed to abate as they neared the ship, the wind whispering secrets through the decaying rigging. The ship's rusted hull creaked and groaned, a mournful symphony of decay that sent shivers down their spines. It was a symphony that echoed the creeping dread in their hearts. The absence of a familiar sound, the sea, was as unsettling as the ship's groaning metal. Climbing the rust-eaten gangplank was like ascending into a tomb. The moment their feet touched the deck, a palpable chill permeated the air, a cold that went deeper than the biting wind and rain. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the decaying structure, a constant reminder of the ship's age and neglect. A chilling silence, an unsettling quietude more terrifying than the storm's deafening roar. They were trapped not just by the sea, but by the ship itself, its decaying frame mirroring their rapidly dwindling hope. This ship held a more profound, more terrible storm than the one they had just escaped. Chapter 2. A Glimmer of Hope. The rusted gangplank groaned under their weight, each step a metallic screech that echoed unnervingly in the oppressive silence. The storm, which had moments before threatened to tear them apart, seemed to have retreated, leaving behind an unnatural calm, a deceptive tranquility that was far more unsettling than the tempest's fury. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the smell of salt, decay, and something else, something indefinably sinister. It clung to the back of the throat, a phantom taste of fear. Finn, still shivering from his near drowning, clutched his life jacket, his eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. The ship, a colossal monument to forgotten luxury, was a graveyard of rust and decay. Sections of the deck were missing, revealing gaping holes that plunged into the darkness below, ominous voids promising unseen horrors. Broken railings, twisted and gnarled like skeletal fingers, clawed at the stormy sky. The windows, where windows once were empty sockets, dark and vacant, their shattered glass glittering like malevolent eyes in the infrequent flashes of lightning that still pierced the gloom. Captain Thorne, despite his years at sea and his iron will, felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a derelict vessel, it was a mausoleum, a floating tomb. The silence was the most terrifying aspect, a heavy, suffocating blanket that muffled even the sound of their own breathing. The occasional groan of the ship's tortured frame was a constant, morbid reminder of its decrepitude, a rhythmic pulse of decay that mirrored the growing unease within their hearts. Silas, ever the pragmatist, began a cursory examination of the ship's structure. He ran a calloused hand along a rusted support beam, the metal crumbling under his touch like ancient bone. "She's held together by rust and sheer stubbornness," he muttered, his voice a low growl swallowed by the cavernous silence. He tapped the beam with the heel of his boot, the sound hollow and alarming. This thing could collapse at any moment. They moved slowly, cautiously, their boots crunching on the layers of accumulated debris, a mixture of rust, decaying wood, and something else that felt disturbingly organic underfoot. A tattered piece of faded wallpaper peeled from the wall, revealing a glimpse of what was once an opulent interior, a stark contrast to its current state of ruin. The faintest whisper of a melody, an almost imperceptible sound, seemed to drift from the darkness. Beyond, a ghostly echo that sent chills down their spines. The interior of the ship was a labyrinth of decaying grandeur. Massive chandeliers, devoid of their crystals, hung precariously from cracked ceilings, their skeletal frames casting long, distorted shadows. Once lavish furnishings were reduced to shredded remnants, their fabric torn and stained, hinting at the passage of time and the relentless assault of the sea. Grand staircases, their banisters crumbling, led to darkened floors, their destinations unknown and potentially perilous. The air hung heavy with the smell of mildew and decay, a scent that clung to the back of the throat and choked the lungs. The pervasive dampness seemed to seep into their very bones, a chilling reminder of the ship's prolonged submersion in the relentless onslaught of the sea. Each step they took was accompanied by the ominous creaks and groans of the aging structure, a symphony of decay that played upon their frayed nerves. As they ventured deeper into the ship's bowels, the darkness deepened, becoming an almost tangible entity that pressed against them, suffocating and claustrophobic. The sporadic flashes of lightning illuminated the scene momentarily, transforming the decaying grandeur into a nightmarish landscape of twisted metal and shadowed recesses. In these fleeting moments of illumination, they glimpsed horrifying glimpses of what might lurk in the darkness, fleeting shadows that moved too quickly to be mere tricks of the light, unsettling whispers carried on the wind. The silence, punctuated only by the ship's groans, became increasingly oppressive, a deafening silence that amplified their own heartbeats and their fearful breaths. Each echoing footfall was a stark reminder of their isolation, their vulnerability, a testament to the chilling silence that threatened to engulf them entirely. The very structure of the ship seemed to be breathing, exhaling the miasma of fear and decay, its decrepit frame mirroring their own increasingly desperate state. The ship wasn't simply derelict, it was malevolent, a malevolent entity feeding on their fear and desperation. They huddled together, seeking warmth and reassurance in each other's presence, but the cold seeped into their bones, a chilling testament to their isolation. The combined chill of the storm, the sea, and the ship's cold steel created an unbearable coldness that penetrated deep into their very souls. This was far worse than the stormy sea. The ghostly melody, faint at first, grew stronger, more insistent. It was a mournful tune, a haunting waltz that seemed to emanate from every shadowed corner, a siren song of despair that drew them deeper into the decaying heart of the vessel. It was a chilling invitation into the depths of the unknown, a whisper that promised untold horrors. As they crept further into the ship's decaying heart, the ghostly tune became increasingly insistent, weaving its way into their minds, twisting their thoughts and clouding their judgment. A wave of paranoia washed over them, as each shadow seemed to writhe and shift, taking on a life of its own. The whispers carried on the wind became more distinct, more malevolent, a chorus of unseen voices that whispered their names, promising pain and torment. They were not alone. That much was now certain. The ship was alive, not with life, but with something far more sinister, something that fed on fear and despair. The hope of survival, once a flickering flame, began to dwindle, replaced by a chilling dread that grew stronger with each passing moment. The derelict liner, once a beacon of hope, had transformed into a cage, a terrifying prison where their only escape was death, or something far worse. Their battle for survival was far from over. It had just begun, in a place far more terrifying than the storm. Tossed sea they had just escaped. The true tempest was yet to break. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dark. The rusted metal groaned under their weight, a sound like the dying breath of a leviathan. They moved in a tight cluster, their flashlights cutting feeble swathes through the oppressive darkness, revealing glimpses of a once opulent interior now ravaged by time and the sea. Velvet curtains, once crimson, hung in tattered strips, their rich fabric reduced to fragile lace, whispering tales of forgotten elegance. Gilded mirrors, shattered and smeared with grime, reflected distorted images, their fractured surfaces mocking their own reflections. The silence was a palpable thing, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic creaks and groans of the ship, a morbid symphony of decay that played upon their increasingly frayed nerves. It was a silence so profound it amplified the frantic thumping of their hearts, each beat a drumbeat of mounting fear. The air hung thick and heavy, a miasma of salt, decay, and something else. Something indefinably sinister that clung to the back of the throat, a taste of dread. Suddenly, a whisper, or was it the wind, brushed against Finn's ear. He froze, his eyes wide with apprehension, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn handle of his knife. It was a sound too soft to decipher, too fleeting to grasp, yet it left an unsettling chill in its wake. He glanced at Captain Thorne, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and apprehension. The captain simply nodded grimly, his gaze sweeping the shadowed corridors with an almost palpable tension. Silas, ever the pragmatist, continued his methodical search, his flashlight beam dancing across the decaying surfaces. He discovered a half-empty bottle of aged brandy, the cork long gone, its contents evaporated, leaving behind only the faintest aroma of burnt sugar and decay. Nearby, a chipped porcelain doll lay face down in the dust, its painted eyes staring blankly at nothing. It was a small detail, yet it added to the growing sense of unease, a macabre doll in a macabre setting. They moved deeper into the ship, the darkness growing more intense, more suffocating. The occasional flicker of lightning illuminating brief, stark scenes only served to intensify the horror. In these fleeting moments, they glimpsed fleeting shadows darting across the corners of their vision. Too fast, too fluid to be mere tricks of the light. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, forming into faint murmurs, unintelligible yet menacing. They were not alone. A discarded newspaper, its ink faded and brittle, lay on a decaying table. Its headline, barely legible, spoke of a missing cruise liner, vanished without a trace years ago. A chilling coincidence, or something more? The date sent a shiver down their spines. It was the same year that the ship's last voyage was documented. The ship seemed to breathe, its groaning timbers a relentless reminder of its age and decrepitude. Each creak, each groan sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. The metal seemed to weep, its rusted surface glistening with a perpetual moisture that spoke of a long and relentless struggle against the elements. The darkness was not just a lack of light, it was an oppressive presence, a suffocating blanket that weighed on their minds as heavily as it did on their bodies. As they ventured down a long, dimly lit corridor, a sudden crash echoed from the end, sending a wave of panic through the small group. Their flashlights snapped into action, their beams dancing nervously ahead, searching for the source of the sound. They found nothing, only more shadows, more whispers, a sense of being watched, of being hunted. The feeling intensified, a profound unease that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. They discovered a grand ballroom, once a scene of glittering revelry, now reduced to a ghostly shell. A shattered mirror lay amongst the dust and debris, its reflection fractured and distorted, a mirror to their own fractured state of mind. The faint scent of perfume, long gone, still lingered in the air, a phantom aroma of forgotten elegance. The contrast between the past grandeur and the present decay was unsettling, a stark reminder of time's relentless march and the inevitability of decay. In the ship's galley, remnants of a meal lay scattered on a table, untouched plates of food, half-eaten sandwiches, a coffee cup still stained with the residue of a forgotten drink. It was evidence of recent habitation, Yet the ship remained disconcertingly empty. Who had been here? And where had they gone? The questions were left unanswered, floating in the oppressive silence, creating more questions than answers. They found a captain's cabin, its luxurious furnishings reduced to tattered remnants, yet meticulously organized. A well-worn nautical chart was spread out on the desk, its markings meticulously detailed. It was an unsettling combination of deliberate order and absolute desertion, a silent testament to a hasty departure, or perhaps a calculated retreat. The whispers seemed to intensify as they moved through the ship. They were no longer subtle suggestions, they were distinct murmurs, faint voices that seemed to follow them from room to room. Sometimes they sounded like laughter, sometimes like sobs, and sometimes like the chilling murmurs of the sea itself. The voices twisted and morphed, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. They moved towards the stern, the ship's groaning growing more pronounced, more violent. The sounds were joined by a series of rhythmic scrapes and bangs, as though something heavy was being dragged along the floor above them. The sound of footsteps, light yet deliberate, sent a cold shiver down their spines. The sense of being watched intensified, a chilling certainty that they were not alone, that something, or someone, was stalking them through the decaying labyrinth of the ship. The darkness itself seemed to press in on them, a suffocating entity that intensified their sense of isolation. Their flashlights became desperate weapons, their beams cutting through the gloom in a futile attempt to pierce the enveloping darkness. The whispers continued, an incessant murmuring that was both maddening and mesmerizing, leading them deeper into the ship's heart, deeper into the growing dread. The decaying ship seemed to be a character in itself, its deteriorating structure mirroring their own deteriorating mental state. The ship's decay a reflection of their crumbling sanity. The line between reality and nightmare was blurring, the boundary between the physical and the psychological dissolving into a chilling ambiguity. They were trapped, not only in the decaying ship, but also within the growing labyrinth of their own fears. The storm outside, once a terrifying threat, seemed a distant memory, replaced by a far greater, far more insidious danger. The true tempest had begun, a tempest not of wind and rain, but of fear, paranoia, and the chilling whispers of the unseen. The derelict cruise liner was no longer just a vessel, it was a living entity, feeding on their fear, its decay mirroring their crumbling hope of survival. The race against time was not just against the ship's collapse, but against their own descent into madness. The battle for survival was far from over. It was just beginning. Chapter 4: First Encounters. The rhythmic creaking of the ship's timbers, a sound that had initially been merely unsettling, now grated on their nerves like a persistent, maddening itch. It was a sound that seemed to seep into their bones, vibrating in their teeth, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. The storm outside, though still raging, had faded into the background, a dull roar compared to the escalating symphony of dread unfolding within the ship's decaying hull. Finn, ever vigilant, was the first to notice the flickering lights. At first, he dismissed it as a faulty connection, a testament to the ship's age and decay. But the flickering persisted, a rhythmic pulse that seemed to mirror the frantic beat of his own heart. It began in the galley, a brief, almost imperceptible dimming, then spread through the corridors, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The shadows stretched and elongated, contorting into shapes that were both familiar and terrifyingly alien. Silas, ever the skeptic, attempted to rationalize the flickering lights as a simple electrical fault. But even he couldn't deny the growing unease, the creeping sensation that they were not alone, that something unseen was watching them, playing with them, testing their resolve. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation, each creak of the ship's frame punctuated by a silent pause that felt heavier than any sound. The silence, once a suffocating blanket, had transformed into something far more sinister, a pregnant hush filled with the promise of something dreadful. Then came the moving objects. A chipped teacup, sitting precariously on the edge of a decaying table in the captain's cabin, slid silently across the surface, stopping just short of the edge. A single dusty book tumbled from a shelf, its pages fluttering open to a random page, as if disturbed by an unseen hand. These seemingly minor events fueled the growing paranoia, each incident adding another layer to the escalating tension. The rational explanations began to crumble, replaced by a gnawing fear that something supernatural, something truly malevolent was at play. Captain Thorne, despite his outward stoicism, showed signs of strain. His usually sharp eyes flickered with uncertainty, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his lantern. He tried to maintain a facade of control, but the exhaustion and growing dread etched deep lines into his weathered face. The weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, pressed heavily upon his shoulders. He attempted to reassure his crew, to project an image of calm amidst the gathering storm, but his voice was laced with a tremor he couldn't quite conceal. The first truly terrifying event occurred while they were searching the ship's lower decks. Silas, leading the way, let out a strangled cry. A fleeting shadow, darker than the already profound darkness of the ship, had darted past him, disappearing around a sharp bend in the corridor. It was too fast, too fluid to be a trick of the light, too substantial to be a mere illusion. The shadow had a distinct, unsettling presence, a chilling reminder that something, or someone, was moving unseen among them. The incident shattered the fragile calm. The whispers, once faint murmurs, became louder, more distinct, morphing into unintelligible mutterings that seemed to follow them through the ship's labyrinthine corridors. Sometimes they sounded like laughter, a chilling, sardonic amusement, at other times like mournful sobs, the lament of trapped souls. The voices shifted and changed, a chorus of spectral sounds that blurred the line between reality and delusion. Paranoia began to take hold, seeping into the cracks of their already strained relationships. Accusations, whispered and hissed, snaked through the group like venomous serpents. Finn, usually calm and collected, became increasingly agitated, his eyes darting nervously, his hand constantly reaching for the knife at his hip. Silas, though still trying to maintain his rational facade, found his skepticism eroding in the face of the escalating events. Even Captain Thorne, the embodiment of stoicism, found his composure fraying at the edges, as much of a threat as the physical dangers they faced. Were they being hunted by a single entity, or were they surrounded by a host of unseen terrors? The whispers, the shadows, the moving objects, were they mere hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and fear, or were they genuine signs of something far more sinister? The lines blurred, the distinction between reality and nightmare dissolving into a terrifying ambiguity. Their flashlights, once sources of illumination and comfort, now served only to highlight the oppressive darkness, revealing fleeting glimpses of the ship's decay and emphasizing their own vulnerability. The flickering lights cast grotesque shadows that danced and writhed, mocking their efforts to find safety, to find answers. The ship itself seemed to breathe, its groaning timbers a relentless reminder of its own demise, a stark reflection of their own dwindling hope. The dwindling supplies added another layer of tension. The remaining food and water were minimal, a stark reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. The growing hunger, coupled with the relentless fear, began to exacerbate their already frayed nerves. Arguments, initially hushed whispers, erupted into heated exchanges, further eroding the bonds of trust that held them together. Sleep became a luxury they could no longer afford. The constant vigilance, the ever-present threat, kept them perpetually on edge. Exhaustion clouded their judgment, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. The hallucinations intensified, the whispers growing louder, clearer, until they felt the phantom touch of unseen hands, heard the disembodied laughter echoing in the darkness. The ship, once a vessel of hope, had transformed into a living tomb, its decaying structure mirroring the crumbling sanity of its trapped inhabitants. The once grand vessel was now a labyrinth of dread, its shadowed corners hiding unseen terrors, its whispering timbers a haunting chorus of their impending doom. The true tempest raged not outside, but within the confines of their terrified minds. Survival was no longer a matter of physical strength or skill, but of maintaining their sanity in the face of escalating horror. The battle. Chapter 5. The Weight of Isolation. The gnawing hunger, a physical manifestation of their dwindling resources, mirrored the emptiness that clawed at Finn's soul. The rhythmic creaks of the ship, once a mere annoyance, had become a relentless drumbeat against the walls of his sanity. He found himself staring at his reflection in the tarnished surface of a spoon, barely recognizing the gaunt, haunted figure staring back. The flickering lights, the whispering shadows, they were all real, weren't they? Or was the isolation pushing him to the brink, twisting his perceptions into something monstrous? He wasn't sure anymore. His past, usually a buried memory, now surfaced with unsettling clarity. The memory of the storm that claimed his family, a relentless tempest that mirrored the one raging within the decaying hull of the ship, haunted him. The crushing weight of survival had become a suffocating blanket, a constant reminder of his failure to protect those he loved. The guilt, a relentless tide, threatened to drown him beneath its weight. He clutched the worn leather-bound journal he'd salvaged from the captain's quarters, its pages filled with faded ink and cryptic writings, seeking a distraction from the darkness that crept into his mind. Each entry, a chilling tale of the ship's past, added another layer to the escalating nightmare. Silas, a man of science and reason, found his rational defenses crumbling under the relentless assault of the supernatural. His skepticism, once a solid shield, now felt like a flimsy paper wall against a raging storm. The logical explanations he had desperately clung to had evaporated, leaving behind a chilling void filled with irrational dread. The shadows, the whispers, the moving objects, they were too tangible, too real to be dismissed as hallucinations. Yet, a part of him still desperately sought a rational explanation. Clinging to the possibility that his mind was playing tricks on him, a desperate attempt to maintain control in the face of utter chaos, he retreated to the ship's library, hoping to find solace in the familiar world of literature. But even the comforting pages of his favorite authors seemed to twist and writhe before his eyes. The words blurred, merging into monstrous shapes that danced on the sea page, mocking his attempts at composure. The quiet rustle of turning pages now sounded like sinister whispers, each word a malevolent message intended to shatter his already fragile sanity. The isolation, the constant fear, had become a breeding ground for paranoia, fueling an agonizing self-doubt. He began questioning his own sanity, questioning the reality of everything around him. Was he losing his mind? Was this the horrifying climax of the ship's curse, or just the desperate delusional ramblings of a man facing his mortality? Captain Thorne, the seasoned mariner, the man who had weathered countless storms, found himself battling a tempest far more insidious than any he had ever encountered at sea. The weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, pressed down on him with crushing force. He knew that his crew's survival depended not only on his navigational skills, but also on his ability to maintain order and hope in the face of utter despair. Yet his own inner turmoil threatened to unravel his composure. He battled exhaustion, the relentless gnawing of fear, and the growing suspicion that he was losing control. His past was a tapestry woven with loss and sacrifice. He had witnessed the disintegration of his own marriage, the fading of his dreams. The ship, a representation of a life at sea, had become his refuge, his solace. The growing horror aboard, he felt, was a reflection of his own emotional shipwreck. The isolation amplified his loneliness, turning the vast ocean surrounding them into a cold, unforgiving reminder of his isolation. Adding to his existing despair, the whispers he heard in the night were not just spectral voices. They were the echoes of his past regrets, and the chilling prophecies of his imminent demise. He fought to project an image of strength, to maintain a semblance of control, but beneath the surface, the fear raged like a wildfire. The confined space, the relentless darkness, amplified the already simmering tensions among the survivors. The dwindling supplies, the growing hunger, the constant fear pushed them to the brink of madness. Accusations flew like poisoned darts, fueled by exhaustion and paranoia. Trust, once the glue that held them together, shattered into a million pieces, leaving them isolated even in each other's presence. Each interaction was fraught with suspicion. Every glance held a hidden meaning. What was once a shared struggle had evolved into a battle of wills, a desperate fight for survival. The isolation wasn't merely physical, it was an insidious erosion of their psyches, a slow, agonizing descent into madness. Finn's guilt, Silas's skepticism, Thorn's weariness. These were no longer individual struggles but intertwined threads of a larger, far more terrifying tapestry of despair. Each man's past trauma, his personal demons, were now magnified, reflected in the distorted mirrors of the ship's decaying hull. The ship itself seemed to feed on their fears, amplifying their anxieties, twisting their perceptions, driving them further into the depths of madness. The creaking timbers, the flickering lights, the whispering voices, they were not merely manifestations of the ship's decay, but were becoming insidious extensions of their fractured minds. The line between reality and delusion was blurring, transforming the derelict ship into a horrifying reflection of their shattered souls. Survival now seemed less about escaping the ship's physical confines and more about escaping the psychological prison they had created for themselves within its decaying walls. The ultimate tempest raged not within the heart of the storm outside, but within the tormented chambers of their minds. The ship, a microcosm of their shared despair, was rapidly consuming them, body and soul, leading them towards an inevitable, horrifying end. The weight of isolation wasn't just a physical burden. It was a suffocating blanket of despair, a chilling testament to the destructive power of fear and the fragile nature of the human psyche. The battle for survival had transformed into a battle against their own minds, a war waged in the suffocating darkness of their isolation, a war that they were rapidly losing. Chapter 6: Unraveling the Mystery. The rusted iron latch groaned a protest as Finn wrestled open the captain's cabin door, the hinges emitting a shriek like a dying animal. Dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight that pierced the grimy portholes, illuminating the decaying grandeur of the room. The air hung thick with the smell of brine and decay, a suffocating perfume of the sea's long-dead embrace. He held aloft the flickering lantern, its feeble light casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked the restless spirits he felt certain haunted these rotting walls. The room was a chaotic tableau of abandonment, a testament to a hasty retreat. Papers lay scattered across the floor, their edges brittle and yellowed with age, like skeletal remains of forgotten narratives. A half-finished game of chess stood on a table, the pieces frozen mid-battle, their ivory and ebony surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. It was as if time itself had stopped, suspended in a moment of irreversible chaos. Silas, ever the pragmatist, meticulously began gathering the scattered papers, his hands moving with a practiced precision that belied the tremor in his voice. "These look like ship's logs," he murmured, his breath fogging slightly in the chilled air. He held up a thick, leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible in places. The handwriting. "It's archaic, but I think I can decipher." Thorn, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, surveyed the room with a heavy heart. He ran a calloused hand over the smooth surface of a tarnished silver locket lying on the floor near a shattered mirror. The locket, engraved with a barely visible crest, felt cold and strangely heavy in his palm. A name, barely visible, was scratched on the back: Eleanor. A wave of nausea washed over him, a phantom echo of a lost love, a life left unfinished. As Silas meticulously deciphered the log entries, a chilling story began to unfold. The entries, fragmented and incomplete, spoke of a voyage beset by unexplained misfortunes, strange disappearances, inexplicable equipment failures, and a growing sense of dread that permeated the ship. The crew, it seemed, had become increasingly paranoid, their accounts riddled with accusations and suspicions. There were mentions of strange occurrences, whispers in the dark, unsettling visions, objects moving on their own, and a pervasive sense of being watched. The captain's entries, written in increasingly erratic scrawls, spoke of a growing despair, a battle against an unseen enemy. The entries abruptly ended mid-sentence, leaving a stark, chilling silence that mirrored the ship's haunting stillness. Amidst the scattered papers, Finn discovered a collection of photographs, their edges frayed and faded. They depicted a lively, vibrant crew, their faces radiating a youthful energy. But a shadow, a palpable sense of impending doom, lingered over these images. One photo, a group portrait taken on the deck, showed a young woman, her face obscured by a shadow that seemed to emanate from the photograph itself. Her presence felt intensely unsettling, a discordant note in the otherwise joyful scene. The images of laughter and camaraderie were starkly contrasted by the crumbling state of the photographs, as if they were attempting to crumble under the weight of some unspeakable horror. Further exploration yielded more clues: personal belongings, a child's worn teddy bear with one button eye missing, a woman's faded silk scarf, a man's worn leather-bound book on celestial navigation, its pages filled with meticulous calculations and astrological charts that, upon closer inspection, seemed increasingly erratic and nonsensical towards the end. Each item held a poignant narrative, a silent testament to lives abruptly interrupted, to dreams shattered by an unseen force. The small trinkets and personal effects, amidst the decay and disarray, felt like a grotesque mockery of once-held dreams and hopes. They were frozen memories of human existence, a poignant testament to lost lives. A tattered map, its edges frayed and worn, hinted at a hidden island, marked with a skull and crossbones, and a cryptic inscription in a language none of them recognized. Its placement, tucked inside the captain's worn sea boots, implied that it had been of vital importance, a potentially life-altering secret carried to its grave. The map's disrepair was a visual representation of the passage of time and the ship's decay, reflecting the story of the voyage as a whole. The map, a symbol of both hope and despair, fueled their growing sense of foreboding. The crew felt increasingly the growing urgency to solve the mystery and discover the dark truth. The deeper they delved into the ship's past, the more deeply the unsettling atmosphere enveloped them. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the whispers more insistent, the air heavier with an unseen dread. The clues they unearthed weren't just fragments of a forgotten history, they were pieces of a horrifying puzzle, a jigsaw depicting a catastrophe of unspeakable proportions. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a vessel of pain, fear, and despair, a repository of untold trauma. The eerie silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of the aging hull, the rhythmic pulse of a dying heart. The discovery of a hidden compartment beneath the captain's bed added another layer to the growing mystery. Inside, nestled amongst faded velvet lining, were several personal journals written by previous crew members. Each entry detailed escalating paranoia, irrational fear, and bizarre occurrences, strange sounds, disembodied voices, and objects moving of their own volition. They spoke of a creeping madness that consumed the crew, driving them to the edge of sanity and beyond. Some entries were filled with desperate pleas for help, others with chilling accounts of violent acts. One particularly horrifying entry described a ritualistic sacrifice, leaving the details deliberately obscured. The fragmented entries were only able to show a fragmented view of the crew's descent into madness, increasing the suspense and mystery. The men's past traumas began to intertwine with the ship's dark history, each man's personal demons mirroring the ship's malevolent essence. Finn's guilt intensified as he read accounts of families lost at sea, their fates eerily mirroring his own tragedy. Silas's skepticism, though still present, began to crumble under the weight of irrefutable evidence of the paranormal. And Thorn, burdened by his past failures, found his leadership faltering as he faced an enemy far more formidable than any storm. As the crew pieced together the fragmented clues, the true nature of the catastrophe began to emerge. A storm, far more terrifying than any natural phenomenon, had consumed the previous crew. A storm that existed both within and outside the ship's decaying hull. It was a tempest of madness, despair, and ultimately death. The ship, it seemed, was not merely abandoned. It was cursed, a repository of a malevolent energy that preyed on the minds of those who dared to sail within its rotting timbers. The clues were not merely objects, they were spectral echoes, haunting whispers of past tragedies, feeding the present terrors. The horrifying realization dawned upon them. Their survival depended not only on escaping the physical constraints of the ship, but also on confronting the psychological turmoil that had claimed those who sailed before them. The ship itself seemed to be feeding upon their fears, amplifying their anxieties and twisting their perceptions, driving them deeper into the abyss of madness. The line between reality and delusion began to blur, transforming the derelict vessel into a horrifying reflection of their shattered souls. The escalating horror was not just a consequence of their physical isolation, but a consequence of the ship's dark legacy, its enduring curse. The men's fight for survival turned into a desperate race against the encroaching madness. The weight of the past was crushing, threatening to sink them as surely as the ocean had swallowed the previous crew. The ship, a grim monument to their shared fate, now held them captive in a nightmarish dance between sanity and despair. Their battle for survival had become a desperate fight to maintain their grip on reality before it was completely consumed by the chilling shadow of the ship's dark past. Chapter 7. Delving Deeper. The air grew colder, thicker, as they descended deeper into the ship's belly. The lantern light, already feeble, struggled to pierce the oppressive darkness, casting elongated, distorted shadows that danced and writhed like phantoms. The wooden stairs groaned under their weight, each step echoing unnervingly in the oppressive silence, a sound that seemed to mock their fragile courage. The scent of brine and decay intensified, mingling with a metallic tang that prickled their nostrils and sent a shiver down their spines. The passageway narrowed, forcing them to move in single file, their shoulders brushing against damp, rotting timbers that felt cold and strangely alive beneath their touch. Finn, leading the way, felt a growing sense of unease. The claustrophobia was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of unseen eyes, the silence broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water seeping from unseen leaks. Each drop a tiny hammer blow against the fragile structure of their sanity. Silas, ever the pragmatist, trailed behind, his flashlight beam cutting a narrow swathe through the darkness, meticulously examining the walls for any signs of hidden compartments or passages. Thorn, his face drawn and pale, brought up the rear, his hand resting on the worn handle of his ancient pistol, the cold metal a small comfort in the face of the encroaching terror. They stumbled upon a heavy oak door, its surface scarred and pitted with age, almost entirely concealed behind a curtain of cobwebs and decaying wood. Finn, his heart pounding in his chest, pushed against the door, its ancient timbers groaning in protest. It creaked open with a sound like a death rattle, revealing a narrow, dimly lit passage, the air within thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something indescribably foul, that made Finn's stomach churn. The passage led them to a small circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves crammed with dusty bottles and jars. The labels, where legible, were written in a language none of them recognized, the script faded and illegible, hinting at forgotten rituals and alchemical experiments. The air hung heavy with the sickly sweet scent of decaying herbs and spices, a nauseating perfume that choked the lungs and stirred a primal fear deep within their souls. In the center of the chamber sat a large wooden table, its surface littered with strange tools and implements, tarnished silver scalpels, rusted surgical instruments, and oddly shaped vials filled with viscous, dark liquids. The scene was a macabre tableau, a silent testament to unimaginable horrors. A single flickering candle cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls, creating the illusion of movement, of unseen eyes watching them from the darkness. The scene was a grotesque parody of a laboratory, an unholy fusion of science and superstition, hinting at a grim experiment gone horribly wrong. Silas felt a growing unease, a sense of something deeply unsettling, something beyond the usual macabre trappings of a decaying ship. The tools and implements were not just tools, they were artifacts of a dark ritual, a chilling testament to human depravity. They moved deeper into the ship's bowels, their progress hindered by the labyrinthine nature of the passages, their way blocked by piles of decaying cargo and the debris of a life abruptly cut short. They found themselves in a cramped, airless space, the walls lined with decaying barrels and chests. The air was thick with the stench of rot and mildew, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on them, making it difficult to breathe. Finn felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling of being watched, of being trapped in a cage of shadows and decay. Suddenly, a low groan echoed from the darkness, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the ship. It was a sound of immense age and suffering, a sound that chilled them to the bone. The men froze, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses straining to discern the source of the sound. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of malevolence that seemed to emanate from the darkness. They continued their search, moving deeper into the bowels of the ship, until they stumbled upon a hidden compartment, concealed behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside, they found a collection of personal diaries, their pages filled with chilling accounts of madness and despair. The entries, scrawled in frantic handwriting, spoke of strange visions, disembodied voices, and a growing sense of paranoia that had gripped the crew. The entries described hallucinations and delusions, an escalating descent into madness. The accounts detailed gruesome scenes, events that were so horrific that the details seemed purposefully blurred, leaving the readers to imagine the horrors inflicted. One diary belonged to a young woman named Ilara, her entries filled with vivid descriptions of a growing horror that seemed to emanate from the ship itself. She described a feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following her every move, of whispers in the dark that seemed to invade her thoughts. Her writing grew increasingly erratic, her words becoming fragmented and nonsensical, as if her mind was unraveling under the strain of unimaginable terror. Her final entry was a single chilling sentence, "It's inside me now." As the men read the diary entries, they noticed a strange pattern, a recurring motif that linked the events to the celestial alignments, to specific astrological events. Thorne, who had a passing knowledge of astrology, recognized the patterns, realizing that the crew's descent into madness seemed to be tied to specific periods of cosmic alignment, as if some unseen force was manipulating the minds of the men on board. The ship became not just a decaying vessel, but a cosmic nexus, a focal point for the dark influences of the cosmos. The diaries revealed a disturbing truth. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, its very structure infused with a malevolent energy that fed on the minds of its occupants, twisting their perceptions, driving them to the brink of madness and beyond. The men's own past traumas were exacerbated by the ship's dark legacy. Each fear was magnified tenfold by the oppressive atmosphere and the knowledge of the horrors that had transpired within the ship's rotting timbers. The weight of the past pressed down on them, a suffocating burden that threatened to overwhelm them. The confined spaces, the decaying ship, and the escalating horror were not just obstacles in their escape, they were components of the curse. The ship was feeding upon their deepest fears, playing upon their anxieties, and transforming their perceptions into something grotesque and distorted. The line between reality and delusion blurred into an impenetrable fog, the truth hidden behind layers of paranoia and despair. Their battle for survival had become a desperate fight to maintain their sanity in the face of an unseen enemy that was far more insidious and terrifying than any storm or sea monster. The ship, a vessel of death and despair, had become their personal hell, a labyrinth of decay and madness with no apparent escape. Chapter 8: Confrontation. The flickering candlelight in the circular chamber cast grotesque shadows that danced and writhed, mimicking the movements of unseen things. A low, guttural moan, barely audible above the drip of water, snaked through the air, raising the hairs on the back of Finn's neck. Silas, his flashlight beam unwavering, scanned the shelves, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Thorn, his hand never straying from his pistol, stood rigidly, his breathing shallow. The silence, thick and suffocating, was broken only by the occasional creak of the ancient ship, a symphony of decay that seemed to anticipate the horror to come. Suddenly, a movement in the periphery, a flicker of shadow at the edge of the lantern's meager light, too quick to be certain, too fleeting to be dismissed. Finn's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a sense of being watched, of unseen eyes boring into him from the darkness beyond the candle's feeble glow. Silas, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the chamber, but found nothing. Only shadows. Deep, inky shadows that seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of their own. Thorn, his senses honed by years spent facing down danger, felt a tremor run through the chamber, a subtle vibration that spoke of something large and unseen moving just beyond their perception. The air grew cold, not just the damp chill of the ship's bowels, but a deeper, more sinister cold, the kind that penetrates to the bone, freezing the blood in one's veins. The scent of brine and decay was now tinged with something else, something acrid and metallic, the smell of blood, old and stale but undeniably present. Another movement. This time clearer, more defined. A shape coalesced at the edge of the candlelight, a fleeting glimpse of something tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness but unmistakably human, or at least what resembled humanity. It was as if the shadows themselves had taken form, a coalescence of darkness given sentience and malice. Its movements were slow, deliberate, yet imbued with an unnatural fluidity, a sense of uncanny grace that unnerved them far more than any brute force could. The creature, for lack of a better term, drifted silently through the chamber, a phantom of the night, its presence more felt than seen. It did not attack, did not make a sound beyond the unsettling rustling of unseen fabric, or perhaps the creaking of aged timbers twisted by its passage. It seemed to simply observe, its presence a palpable weight in the air, a looming threat that filled the chamber with dread. The very air crackled with a malevolent energy, the silence alive with a silent malevolence that paralyzed them with terror. The creature's form flickered in and out of existence, as if it were merely a figment of their imagination, a trick of the light and shadow. Yet, the feeling of its presence remained, a cold certainty that something profoundly wrong, something profoundly evil, was in that room with them. The three men stood frozen, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds, their breath held captive in their lungs. The horror wasn't in the violence or the gore, but in the anticipation of it, the sheer malevolent potential that emanated from the creature. After what felt like an eternity, just as swiftly as it appeared, the figure receded back into the darkness. The shadows shifted, reformed, and the creature was gone, leaving behind only a chilling silence and the lingering scent of fear. The candlelight trembled, its flame threatening to extinguish, casting a new, more disturbing pattern of shadows that pulsed and twisted like living things. The silence, now heavier than ever, hung in the air. Finn, his face pale and streaked with sweat, let out a shaky breath. Silas, his hand still gripping his flashlight, turned his gaze from the receding shadows to his companions, his eyes revealing a profound unease. Thorn, his hand instinctively going to his pistol, checked the chamber, the cold metal a small comfort against the gnawing horror that still clung to the chamber like a shroud. They exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear, disbelief, and a growing sense of dread. The experience had confirmed their worst fears. The rumors, the stories, the whispers they had heard, they weren't just stories. The ship was far more than a decaying vessel. It was a living, breathing entity, infused with a malevolent energy that manifested in the form of these terrifying shadows. The implications were staggering, terrifying. If these creatures were merely a manifestation of the ship's curse, what else lurked in the depths of its decaying hull? What other horrors awaited them as they continued their descent into the heart of darkness? The brief encounter, though fleeting, had irrevocably changed their perspective. Their mission had shifted, evolving from a simple search for answers to a desperate fight for survival against a foe that seemed to defy the laws of nature and reality. The air hung heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. The silence was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing, the creaking of the ship, and the relentless drip, drip, drip of water. Each drop a chilling reminder of the unseen horrors that lurked just beyond their perception. The encounter had shattered their illusion of control, revealing the true extent of the danger they faced. The line between reality and delusion was blurring, and with every passing moment, the grip of the ship's curse tightened. The men moved with a newfound caution, their senses heightened, their every step measured and deliberate. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, teasing them with fleeting glimpses of movement at the edge of their vision. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, the sense of dread intensifying with each passing moment. They were no longer simply exploring a haunted ship. They were trapped in a living nightmare, a labyrinth of decay and malevolence with no clear path to escape. The ship, once a mere vessel, had become a sentient entity, a malevolent force that preyed on their fears, their anxieties, and their deepest vulnerabilities. The diaries they had discovered had offered a glimpse into the descent into madness of the previous crew. Now, they were experiencing that descent firsthand, each fear, each paranoia, magnified by the ship's oppressive atmosphere, by the palpable sense of evil that permeated every inch of its decaying hull. They pressed on, their progress slow and deliberate, each step an act of defiance against the encroaching darkness, a desperate attempt to maintain their sanity in the face of an enemy that was far more insidious and terrifying than any storm or sea monster. The ship's decaying timbers seemed to whisper secrets to them. Their fears echoed in the groan of the ship, the creak of the planks under their feet, the drip of water, a constant, chilling reminder of the horrors that had transpired within its decaying walls. The past had become a palpable presence, a suffocating weight that threatened to crush them beneath its burden. The confrontation had not been a battle of brute force, but a battle for their minds, a silent war waged against the insidious influence of the ship's malevolent energy. They were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their sanity, struggling to maintain a grip on reality as the line between perception and delusion continued to blur. The descent into the heart of the ship was no longer a simple exploration. It was a descent into their own personal hells, each fear magnified, each doubt amplified by the living nightmare that was the ship itself. The darkness was not just outside, it was inside, twisting their minds, threatening to consume them entirely. And the shadowy figures, a mere glimpse, a fleeting impression, had become a haunting precursor of the horrors that yet remained to be discovered. The true extent of the curse and the ship's horrifying secrets remained chillingly unknown. Chapter 10: Fractured Realities. The dripping water, a relentless metronome of dread, seemed to beat in time with the frantic hammering of Finn's heart. He stared at his hands, his knuckles bone-white, gripping the worn wood of the railing. The shadows, he swore, were shifting again, coalescing, forming fleeting glimpses of faces, distorted, agonized, their eyes burning with a terrifying understanding. He rubbed his eyes, desperately trying to shake off the image, but they persisted, these phantasmal faces, mocking his efforts to maintain his grip on reality. Silas, his face gaunt and drawn, muttered something unintelligible, his voice barely a whisper above the groan of the ship. He clutched his flashlight, its beam a feeble shield against the encroaching darkness, but the light itself seemed to quiver, distorted by the oppressive atmosphere, as if the very fabric of unraveling. His eyes were wild, unfocused, reflecting a growing fear that went beyond the tangible threats they faced. He was grappling with something far more insidious, the creeping tendrils of madness. Thorn, stoic and silent for so long, finally cracked. His usually steady hand trembled as he reached for his pistol, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal. He whispered, his voice barely audible, "It's in the walls. It's in our heads." He stared into the darkness, his gaze piercing the shadows, but seeing only the reflection of his own deepening despair. The lines between his reality and the horrific imaginings of the ship were blurring, merging into a terrifying, indivisible whole. The ship itself seemed to be actively feeding their fears. Every creak of the timbers, every groan of the hull, sounded like a whisper, a taunting reminder of their vulnerability. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them, intensifying their paranoia and escalating their descent into madness. They were no longer simply navigating a haunted vessel, they were trapped within a labyrinth of their own minds, the ship a malevolent puppeteer manipulating their fears and anxieties. Finn experienced vivid nightmares that bled into his waking hours. He would find himself standing on a deck that shifted and tilted, the horizon a swirling vortex of nauseating colors. The faces in the shadows morphed and changed, becoming the faces of lost loved ones, their eyes filled with an unbearable sorrow and pleading for help. He'd wake up screaming, his body drenched in a cold sweat, the echoing creaks of the ship a mocking soundtrack to his terror. The thin line between dream and reality was becoming almost non-existent. Silas's hallucinations were different, fragmented memories of his past, distorted and twisted into horrific scenarios. He saw his childhood home engulfed in flames, his family screaming, their faces contorted in agony. He'd feel the searing heat on his skin, even though the air of the ship remained cold. These fragmented memories, fueled by the ship's malevolent energy, became nightmarish visions, blurring the line between his past and the present, leaving him lost and confused. Thorn's descent was the most subtle, a creeping paranoia that gnawed at his composure. He started seeing movements in the periphery, shadows shifting just beyond the reach of his flashlight. The ship seemed to anticipate his every move, reacting to his thoughts, the creaking timbers mimicking his heartbeat. He began questioning everything he saw and heard, his confidence eroding with each passing moment. He became hypervigilant, jumpy, constantly checking his surroundings, his weapon never far from his hand. His grip on reality was slowly slipping, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. The food, now dwindling, was no longer just sustenance, but a potential catalyst for hallucinations. Finn, after eating a piece of stale biscuit, saw the biscuit morph into a bloated, decaying rat, the smell of rotting flesh filling his nostrils. Silas, after drinking some water, felt the water change into warm, viscous blood that felt like it was crawling under his skin. Even the shared experiences of these hallucinations felt like a shared, spiraling madness. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. Even in the brief moments they could manage to close their eyes, their minds were consumed by terrifying visions. They would see the twisted bodies of previous victims, their eyes wide and pleading, their limbs contorted and broken. The ship's malevolent presence seemed to seep into their dreams, amplifying their fears, turning their nightmares into a living, breathing horror. The ship itself seemed to be a catalyst for their mental disintegration. Its oppressive atmosphere, the suffocating darkness, the constant creaking and groaning, all of it conspired to break their wills. The diaries of the previous crew, detailing their descent into madness, served not just as a historical record, but also as a premonition of their own fate. They were reliving those horrifying experiences, their fears reflected in the decaying timbers, the dripping water, the oppressive silence. The ship was not merely a haunted vessel, it was a living entity, feeding off their fears, driving them to the edge of sanity. As their mental state deteriorated, the line between the tangible and the intangible blurred beyond recognition. Was the shape they saw flitting through the shadows real, or a manifestation of their shared delusion? Was the chilling whisper they heard a product of their collective paranoia, or the voice of the ship itself? The constant questioning, the lack of certainty, the encroaching fear, it all contributed to a growing sense of hopelessness. They were lost in a labyrinth of their own minds, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The reality they had once known had become a distant memory, fading into the shadows along with their hopes of survival. The ship's curse was not just a physical threat, it was a psychological assault, a slow and agonizing erosion of their very minds. And as their sanity crumbled, the true horror of the situation became horrifyingly apparent. Not the external threat, but the insidious nature of their internal demons, amplified and manipulated by the ship's malevolent presence. Their fight for survival had become a battle against themselves, a fight for their very sanity. As the ship's curse took hold, tightening its grip with each terrifying hallucination, each crippling nightmare, each moment of escalating doubt, the past, the present, and the horrors yet to come blended seamlessly into a horrifying, inescapable present. Chapter 11: Desperate Measures. The gnawing hunger was almost as terrifying as the shadows. Their meager rations were gone, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that mirrored the hollowness growing inside them. Finn, driven by a desperate need to quell the insistent pangs in his stomach, began scavenging. He rummaged through the decaying stores, finding only moldy biscuits and rancid preserved meats. The stench alone was enough to induce nausea, yet the primal urge to survive overrode his revulsion. He ate a handful of the moldy biscuits, the taste a bitter reminder of their dwindling hope. The hallucination followed swiftly, but this time it was different. Instead of a rat, he saw his own face, bloated and decaying, staring back at him with hollow, accusing eyes. The image seared itself into his memory, a horrifying reflection of his deteriorating state. Silas, meanwhile, was consumed by a desperate search for fresh water. He had been hallucinating for days, his past traumas manifesting as vivid, inescapable nightmares. He clung to the memory of a spring he'd once known near his childhood home, a place of serene beauty, now twisted into a grotesque parody of itself in his mind. He moved through the ship with a feverish determination, searching every nook and cranny, convinced that if he could just find fresh water, it would somehow cleanse him of the ship's insidious curse, somehow restore his fragmented sanity. His efforts yielded nothing but more foul-smelling water casks, each one a potential trigger for another nightmarish vision. Thorn, despite his stoic exterior, was unraveling from within. His paranoia had reached a fever pitch, convinced that every creak of the ship, every rustle of the rigging, was a deliberate attempt to lure him into a trap. He was constantly on edge, his hand never straying far from his pistol. He started barricading himself in his small cabin, afraid to venture out. Yet, driven by the gnawing fear that staying in one place would only hasten his demise, he would sit in the dark, his eyes darting towards the corners of the room, his breath hitching as he convinced himself that a shadowy figure was lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Their desperation led to conflict. A clash erupted between Silas and Thorn over a dwindling supply of kerosene needed for their lanterns and makeshift stove. The argument escalated into shouting match, each man fueled by exhaustion, hunger, and the growing madness that consumed them. Finn, caught in the middle, felt his own rage simmering beneath the surface. He had always been the peacemaker of the crew, but the relentless horror had eroded his patience, stripping him bare of his usual calm demeanor. The fight ended with Thorn retreating to his cabin, wounded both physically and emotionally, Silas nursing a bruised arm, and Finn left feeling a deepening sense of foreboding. The fragile bonds of camaraderie were crumbling faster than their sanity. Their sanity was a shared burden, a collective delusion that threatened to swallow them whole. They began to question not only their own perceptions, but those of their companions. Was Silas's account of the fresh water truly real, or a manifestation of his hallucinatory state? Was Thorn's fear of the shadowy figure justified, or simply another product of his paranoia? Even Finn, he began to doubt the reality of his own experiences, the line between nightmare and reality blurring into an indistinguishable haze. The ship was not just a physical threat, it was a psychological weapon, expertly chipping away at the foundation of their collective sanity, their shared reality. In a moment of desperate clarity, Silas remembered the old maps he found earlier. A flicker of hope reignited within him, a possibility of escape from this cursed vessel. He convinced Thorn, amidst his paranoia, and Finn, clinging to dwindling hope, that they needed to check their position and attempt to find a way out. They found the maps, their pages brittle and faded, revealing a labyrinthine chart of the vessel's interior, routes never shown on the initial blueprints. It was a testament to a history far darker, a history that the ship was desperately trying to conceal. The maps detailed previously unknown passages and hidden compartments, the existence of which sent shivers down their spines. Armed with the maps, they ventured into the bowels of the ship, navigating the treacherous corridors that seemed to shift and change with every step. The air grew heavy, the stench of decay intensified, as the ship seemed to actively resist their advance. They passed through chambers filled with the rusted remains of machinery, the echoes of their footsteps sounding like the whispers of past victims. Every shadow seemed to writhe and twist, and every creak of the ship seemed to be a taunt, a reminder of their desperate situation. The sense of dread was more oppressive than ever, and their fears were magnified, twisting into new forms of psychological terror. Thorn, spurred by a desperate need for action, saw the maps as a clue, believing there was a way out from the psychological nightmare and the physical entrapment that the ship had woven around them. He pushed himself forward despite his fear, despite his ever-growing conviction that the ship was watching them. He pushed himself to see through his hallucinations and believe in the reality of the maps. As they navigated the maze-like passages, Silas experienced a surge of vivid, fragmented memories, a fleeting image of his family, a terrifying glimpse of the fire that destroyed his home, a moment of clarity that felt like it was both a memory and a premonition. These memories were no longer separate from his current situation. They were all merging in a nightmarish concoction that made it harder to distinguish what was the physical reality and what was just in his mind. He felt the familiar searing heat on his skin, despite the cold air of the ship, the horrifying sounds of screams piercing through the ship's groans. The ship, in a sense, had become a mirror reflecting his darkest fears, compounding the nightmare and further blurring the line between past, present, and imagination. Finn, on the other hand, experienced a different kind of hallucination. He felt the presence of the victims, the lost souls who had perished aboard this cursed vessel. He could almost see the ghostly forms of the deceased, their spectral eyes fixed on him, their emaciated hands reaching out as if to plead for help, to share their agony. The air vibrated with their silent screams, their collective misery pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. These visions were not just terrifying, They were emotionally exhausting. The weight of their suffering felt like a tangible burden. In this shared descent into despair and delusion, their desperation forced them to make choices, to confront the limits of their sanity and their willingness to survive. Their individual struggles were intensified by their shared experience. The horrors they were facing weren't just personal, they were a shared nightmare. Their actions, their every decision, were infused with a mixture of desperation, fear, and primal survival instincts. Each step propelling them deeper into the heart of the ship and closer to the terrifying truth that awaited them. The journey into the unknown depths of the ship became a terrifying reflection of their own deteriorating mental state. Their fight for survival had become a battle against not only the ship, but against their own minds, a relentless fight against a shared descent into madness. Chapter 12: The Ship's Secret. The rusted metal groaned under their weight as they pushed through a particularly narrow passage, the air growing thick with the cloying smell of brine and decay. The flickering beams of their lanterns cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things, feeding their growing paranoia. Thorn, his eyes wide and unfocused, gripped his pistol tighter, his knuckles bone-white. He muttered to himself, his words barely audible above the ship's mournful sighs, convinced that something was watching them, something unseen, something malevolent. Silas, his face pale and drawn, stumbled, catching himself on a protruding pipe. A wave of nausea washed over him, the fragmented memories of the fire, the screams, the searing heat, returning with renewed intensity. He gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the phantom heat searing his skin. The past and present merged into a nightmarish blend, making it impossible to distinguish one from the other. He felt the ship was not merely a vessel, it was a living entity, feeding off their fear and despair. Finn, ever the observer, noted the peculiar pattern of the rust on the metal, the way it seemed to form strange, almost skeletal shapes. It wasn't just decay, he realized, it was something else, a deliberate distortion, a grotesque, unnatural alteration of the metal itself. A chilling thought formed in his mind. This wasn't simply a derelict ship, it was a carefully constructed prison, a twisted monument to unspeakable horrors. He could almost feel the presence of the spectral forms of the victims clinging to the metal, their silent screams echoing in the void. They finally reached a large circular chamber, the air here even heavier, more suffocating. The walls were lined with shelves, once laden with supplies, now only holding the decaying remnants of their contents. In the center of the chamber stood a large metal chest, its surface etched with strange, indecipherable symbols. The lantern light glinted off the metal, revealing a tarnished brass plate on its surface. Silas, his heart pounding in his chest, approached cautiously and traced the plate with his finger. As he did, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a dark, gaping maw that seemed to swallow the light. Hesitantly, they entered the hidden chamber, the air growing colder, a damp chill settling over their skin. The stench of decay became unbearable, a nauseating mixture of salt, mildew, and something else, something sickeningly sweet. The chamber was circular, with walls lined with faded tapestries, depicting scenes of grotesque ritual and unspeakable depravity. The tapestries themselves seemed to writhe and shift, their colors blurring and fading, as if they were trying to hide their horrifying secrets. In the center of the chamber stood a single ornate table, upon which lay a collection of disturbing artifacts. Tarnished silver goblets, their rims stained a dark, almost blood-red hue, a collection of antique nautical instruments, their needles frozen mid-motion, frozen in a moment of terrible tragedy, and a single leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, its cover adorned with a symbol eerily reminiscent of the markings on the chest. Silas carefully picked up the journal, its pages fragile beneath his touch. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the faded script. The journal was the log of Captain Elias Thorne, the ship's original captain, a man whose name sent a chill down their spines. a name linked inextricably to the dark history of this cursed vessel. The captain's chilling entries chronicled the voyage, but not in the way any sane man would have recorded it. He wrote of strange occurrences at sea, of unexplained disappearances, of whispers in the dark, and increasingly desperate acts of violence and ritualistic sacrifice. Elias's descent into madness was painfully evident in the journal's pages, the entries becoming more incoherent, filled with fragmented sentences, strange symbols, and increasingly disturbing illustrations. He detailed experiments designed to exploit the power of the sea, to harness some unknown force for his own twisted ends. His entries hinted at a horrifying ritual, an attempt to awaken something ancient and malevolent from the depths of the ocean. His obsession, the journal seemed to scream, was fueled by a dark pact made in an attempt to achieve immortality. The journal detailed his crew's growing terror, their desperate attempts to escape his grasp, their horrifying fates. He spoke of sacrificing his men to appease an ancient sea god, whose favor he sought. He called the entity by a name that echoed across the chamber in their minds, Dagon. His words hinted at horrific rituals, unholy pacts, and the invocation of an unimaginable power from the depths. His handwriting, initially neat and legible, deteriorated into frantic scrawls, mirroring his escalating madness. His obsession with immortality consumed him, blurring the lines between reality and delusion. The lines between captain and monster were as blurred and disorienting as the tapestry's weaving. Finn, reading over Silas's shoulder, felt a wave of icy dread wash over him. He could almost see the events unfolding before his eyes, the ghostly forms of the crewmen, their screams, their desperate struggles, all played out in vivid, sickening detail. The ship's emptiness was no longer a mystery, it was a testament to the captain's gruesome work. The vessel itself, it seemed, was a massive floating tomb. The truth was horrifying. The ship wasn't haunted, it was possessed. It was a vessel imbued with an unholy power, the result of Elias Thorne's dark rituals. The shadows weren't simply the product of their delirium, but the manifestations of the entity Dagon, a cosmic horror awakened from its slumber in the depths. The strange events, the hallucinations, the growing madness, it was all orchestrated by this ancient entity, feeding on the fear and despair of those trapped aboard. The ship wasn't just a ship, it was a conduit, a grotesque vessel carrying the entity's malevolent energy across the ocean. It was a living manifestation of an ancient evil. The revelation explained the ship's strange emptiness, its seemingly shifting corridors, its oppressive atmosphere. It was all deliberate, designed to trap its victims and feed the entity Dagon. They weren't just survivors, they were sacrifices, chosen victims for a horrifying ritual, their sanity deliberately eroded to facilitate the entity's control. The ship was not merely haunted, it was possessed, a testament to a terrifying cosmic horror whose presence explained the terrible things they had seen and experienced. Thorne, his paranoia temporarily superseded by a chilling understanding, stared at the journal's final entry, a blood-stained page detailing the invocation ritual and a terrifying prophecy. A prophecy that included them. Their arrival on the ship wasn't an accident, it was a fulfillment of the prophecy. They had been led to the ship, not to escape, but to become the final sacrifices to the entity Dagon. The horrifying realization settled upon them like a shroud, a crushing weight of despair that threatened to extinguish their last flicker of hope. The last entry was a chilling testament to the captain's final, desperate act, an attempt to bind Dagon to the ship permanently, ensuring the entity would remain trapped within the vessel's confines, but at the cost of his own soul, and ultimately, the lives of everyone who dared to enter. The cursed vessel, it seemed, was now their tomb. Their escape from the ship's physical prison became inconsequential, their fate irrevocably tied to the ancient evil within its rotting hull, an unholy entity that had chosen them as its next offering. The truth of the ship's secret was far more terrifying than any of them could have ever imagined, plunging them into a deeper abyss of despair and a hopeless fight for survival against a far greater and ancient evil. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of dread as the reality of their predicament sunk in. Their fight for survival had morphed into an impossible battle against an unimaginable foe. The ship's secret was not just a revelation, it was a death sentence. Chapter 13, Final Confrontation. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of dread. The journal, clutched in Silas's trembling hand, lay open to the final blood-stained page, its ink a gruesome testament to Captain Thorne's final, desperate act. The prophecy, scrawled in a frantic hand, spoke of 3 souls, drawn to the ship by an unseen force, destined to become the final offering to Dagon. 3 souls, Silas, Finn, and Thorne himself, ironically, the last piece of the puzzle in his own horrifying design. Thorne, the man who had been their leader, their protector, was now revealed to be the architect of their destruction. His descent into madness had led him down a path of unspeakable horror, his misguided pursuit of immortality unleashing an ancient evil upon the world. The whispers, the shadows, the unsettling shifts in the ship's layout, these weren't merely the product of their exhaustion or fear, they were the deliberate machinations of Dagon. A guttural groan echoed through the chamber, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The tapestries on the walls writhed and pulsed, their grotesque scenes momentarily coalescing into a horrifying vision. A colossal, many-tentacled monstrosity rising from the depths, its eyes burning with malevolent intelligence. The air grew thick and heavy, the stench of decay intensifying, becoming almost palpable, laced with a sickeningly sweet perfume. The very fabric of reality seemed to fray at the edges, the boundaries between sanity and madness dissolving into a chaotic vortex. A low, guttural chanting began, rising slowly from the depths of the ship, growing in intensity, weaving a sinister spell. The chanting echoed the rhythmic pulse of the sea, a hypnotic rhythm that threatened to ensnare their minds. The metal walls of the chamber seemed to hum in response, resonating with the unholy melody, amplifying the dread that coiled around their hearts like icy serpents. Suddenly, the chamber was plunged into darkness. The lanterns, their flames flickering erratically, sputtered and died, leaving them in absolute blackness. The chanting grew louder, closer, accompanied by the slithering sound of something vast and unseen moving through the confined space. Panic threatened to overwhelm them, but the sheer horror of their situation held them captive. They were surrounded, not just by darkness, but by something far more sinister, something ancient and malevolent. Then, just as suddenly, the darkness was shattered by a blinding flash of light. The tapestries blazed, their colors intensified, revealing images of unimaginable horror, ritual sacrifices, grotesque sea creatures, the horrifying form of Dagon itself revealed in its full, horrifying glory. The light was followed by an agonizing screech, a sound that tore through their eardrums and echoed in their minds, a sound that seemed to claw at their sanity. Silas, his eyes wide with terror, fumbled for his pistol, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He fired blindly into the darkness, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. The recoil sent a jolt through his body, a small, futile act of defiance against the cosmic horror that surrounded them. Finn, his eyes fixed on the still blazing tapestries, saw images shift and twist, revealing glimpses of a ritual unfolding, a sacrifice that was meant to be their own. He saw distorted figures, their bodies contorted and broken, their screams silenced by the sea's relentless roar. The visions were punctuated by glimpses of Dagon's form, a glimpse into the unimaginable power and cruelty of the ancient entity. Thorne, his sanity hanging by a thread, began to laugh, a chilling hollow sound that echoed through the chamber. He spoke of the ritual, of the power he had sought, the immortality he had craved. His words were disjointed, his logic shattered, his very mind ravaged by the entity he had sought to control. He had become a pawn, an instrument in the cosmic horror's game of power. The darkness pulsed, revealing glimpses of horrifying forms, tendrils of shadows stretching out from the unseen corners of the chamber, their touch causing agonizing burns. The air itself seemed to press down on them, squeezing the breath from their lungs, crushing them beneath the weight of its malevolent presence. Silas, regaining his composure, pulled Finn and Thorn behind a fallen shelf. The sounds around them intensified, scratching, slithering, the guttural chanting growing into a deafening roar. They huddled together, their breath ragged and shallow, their hearts pounding like drums in the suffocating silence. The battle began, a terrifying struggle against an unimaginable foe. Their weapons, their pistols, a rusty pipe, even the journal itself, were pathetically inadequate against the cosmic horror that surrounded them. But they fought, driven by a desperate desire to survive, a fierce will to defy the inevitable. Silas, armed with his pistol, fired repeatedly, but his shots seemed to have little effect. The shadowy forms absorbed the bullets, as if they were nothing more than raindrops on a storm-tossed sea. Finn, using his knowledge of the ship's structure, attempted to guide them through the labyrinthine corridors, seeking an escape, a way to avoid their fate. Thorn, his madness flickering, occasionally displayed moments of clarity, providing glimpses of insight into the ritual and the entity's weaknesses. The confrontation was relentless, a brutal ballet of fear and desperation. They fought off the unseen creatures, dodging shadowy tendrils, bracing against crushing waves of pressure. Every creak of the ship, every whisper of wind added to the cacophony of terror. Hours blurred into a nightmarish eternity. The weight of their impending doom pressed down on them, but they refused to surrender. They used their cunning, their courage, their shared desperation to fight back against the suffocating horror. They fought not just for survival, but for their humanity, their dignity in the face of unimaginable evil. Finally, as dawn broke, casting a pallid light through the decaying windows of the hidden chamber, they found a weakness. Thorn, his eyes filled with a chilling clarity, directed them to a hidden compartment within the chest. Inside, amidst the tarnished silver and antique instruments, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. The box contained a single obsidian shard, pulsating with a faint inner light. Thorn explained, in a surprisingly calm voice, that this was the key, a relic of immense power, capable of banishing Dagon back to the abyss. The ritual needed the combined energies of all three to work, and their destiny had been woven together to defeat their captor. With trembling hands, they each touched the shard. A wave of immense energy surged through them, a torrent of light and power that cleansed them of the fear and despair that had plagued them. The obsidian shard glowed brighter, its light piercing through the darkness, banishing the shadows and creatures. The chanting ceased, replaced by a deafening shriek of anguish. The ship shook violently, groaning under the strain of the ancient entity's departure. The tapestries withered and crumbled, their colors fading into dust. The air cleared, the smell of decay replaced by the fresh, clean scent of the sea. As the last vestiges of Dagon's power faded, a blinding white light erupted from the obsidian shard. Then, silence. A terrifying, absolute silence. The horror was over, their ordeal was concluded. But the cost of victory was etched deeply into their souls. The three souls who had been destined for sacrifice had saved themselves, only to be left adrift in an ocean of trauma, their reality irrevocably altered. They had survived a cosmic horror, but they were forever changed. Their escape was not a freedom, but a passage into a new realm of personal hell. They survived, but at a terrifying price. The ocean, once their home, would forever hold a darker secret, a haunting memory, etched into the very fabric of their being. The ship, now silent and empty, would forever drift, a ghostly monument to their victory over the impossible. Chapter 14. Escape or Demise. The obsidian shard, now inert in Silas's hand, felt strangely cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the searing energy it had unleashed moments before. The silence that followed Dagon's retreat was more terrifying than the creature's presence itself. It was a silence pregnant with the weight of what they had endured, a silence that echoed the emptiness now gnawing at their souls. The ship, once a living, breathing entity of dread, was now eerily still, a ghost ship adrift in a sea of their shared trauma. Finn, his face pale and drawn, leaned against the shattered remains of the tapestry, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and had glimpsed something far more horrifying than death itself. The visions he had witnessed during the ritual, the grotesque sacrifices, the twisted forms of the damned, had left an indelible mark on his psyche, a haunting reminder of the unimaginable horrors they had barely escaped. Thorn, surprisingly, was the most composed of the three. The madness that had gripped him seemed to have retreated with the departure of Dagon, leaving behind a shell of a man, exhausted but strangely at peace. His eyes, though still haunted, held a flicker of lucidity, a quiet acceptance of the brutal reality they now faced. He had played a crucial role in their salvation, his knowledge of the ritual proving indispensable, but the cost of his participation remained etched upon his face. He was a survivor of a cosmic horror, forever marked by the experience. Their immediate surroundings, the once horrifying chamber, were now devoid of the malevolent energy that had permeated the air. The tapestries lay in ruins, their vibrant colors faded, their grotesque images reduced to dust. The stench of decay was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the sea air filtering in through the damaged windows. But the lingering feeling of dread remained, a heavy cloak clinging to their hearts, a constant reminder of their brush with oblivion. The question of escape now loomed large. The ship, though, seemingly liberated from Dagon's influence, was still a wreck, its internal structure compromised, its navigational systems likely destroyed. The sea, once their familiar home, was now a hostile expanse of unforgiving waters. They were stranded, vulnerable, and utterly alone on a damaged vessel far from any land. The storm that had brought them here had passed, but the tempest within their souls raged on. Silas, ever the pragmatist, began assessing their situation. He checked his pistol, confirming the remaining bullets, a grim tally of their dwindling resources. The ship's layout, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien and treacherous, a maze of shadowed corridors and hidden dangers. Each step they took felt like navigating a minefield, unsure of what lurked around every corner. The radio remained silent, another blow to their hopes of rescue. Their cries for help had been swallowed by the storm, unanswered prayers lost to the vastness of the ocean. They were truly alone, dependent entirely on their own wits and strength to survive. The choice before them was stark: attempt to navigate the damaged vessel and launch one of the few remaining lifeboats, risking the treacherous seas and the possibility of further encounters with unknown dangers, or to remain aboard the derelict ship, succumbing to the lingering horrors and awaiting an uncertain fate. The first option, escape, was daunting. The seas remained rough, the storm's aftermath leaving the waters unpredictable and unforgiving. The lifeboats were damaged, their hulls battered, their supplies depleted. A successful launch was far from guaranteed, and the journey to land would be long and perilous, exposing them to the elements, potential encounters with other vessels, and the ever-present threat of the sea itself. The second option, surrender, was equally terrifying. They might not face further direct threats from Dagon, but the psychological toll of their experience remained immense. The ship itself, now eerily silent, held the ghosts of their ordeal, the constant reminder of their near-death encounter. The trauma, the fear, the haunting images, these would remain, potentially driving them to madness. The ship could become their tomb, a watery grave far from civilization, a fate just as terrifying as a confrontation with the cosmic horror itself. The decision hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that crackled between the three men. They looked at each other, their eyes reflecting their shared fear and uncertainty. Silas, the leader, saw the exhaustion in Finn's eyes, the haunted emptiness in Thorn's gaze. They were broken, scarred, but not defeated. They had stared into the face of cosmic horror and survived. Now they faced a new challenge, a less dramatic but equally fatal test of their will to live. Hours passed in agonizing deliberation. The rising sun cast long shadows across the decaying ship, highlighting the extent of its damage. Silas meticulously checked the lifeboats, assessing their seaworthiness. Finn, despite his inner turmoil, displayed a surprising resilience, poring over nautical charts, trying to determine their location and plot a course. Thorn, surprisingly, provided unexpected assistance, his knowledge of the ship's mechanics proving invaluable. The process of repairing the lifeboat was slow and arduous. They worked tirelessly, their hands raw and bleeding, fueled by a desperate hope of survival. The silence of the ship was broken only by the sound of their tools, the creaks and groans of the aging vessel, and the rhythmic crash of waves against its hull. Each creak sounded like a ticking clock, counting down to their decision and the inevitable consequences. As twilight approached, they faced their decision. The lifeboat, though not perfect, was seaworthy enough. The risk was considerable, but staying aboard the ship felt like a slow, agonizing death. The sea's harsh beauty, once a source of comfort, now seemed menacing, but hope, however fragile, ignited a spark within them. They could not remain prisoners of their past, their terror. They had to fight for their future, however uncertain. The launch was perilous. The waves were unforgiving, throwing the small boat about like a toy. The sea tested their strength, challenging their resilience. But they persevered, driven by the shared will to survive, to escape the clutches of the sea and the horrors they had left behind. The choice was made, and their escape was underway, a desperate gamble against the endless expanse of the ocean. Their journey home wasn't just a physical one. It was a struggle to reclaim their sanity, to find solace in the aftermath of a cosmic horror they had managed to overcome. Their survival would be a testament to their resilience, but the scars of their ordeal would linger, shaping the rest of their lives, etched as deeply as the memories of the unseen horrors they had faced. Chapter 15: The Aftermath. The small lifeboat, tossed about like a leaf in a hurricane, offered little comfort. The rhythmic slap of waves against its hull was a constant, jarring reminder of their precarious situation. Finn, his face etched with exhaustion but his eyes fixed on the horizon, navigated with a grim determination. He had charted a course, a gamble based on scant information and fading hope, aiming for the nearest known shipping lane, a sliver of possibility in the vast emptiness of the ocean. Silas, his hands raw and bleeding, bailed furiously, the water sloshing in the bottom of the boat, a constant threat of capsizing. The storm's aftermath left the sea a treacherous tapestry of swells and hidden currents, each wave a potential death sentence. The weight of their shared ordeal hung heavy in the air, a silent testament to the horrors they had barely escaped. The silence, broken only by the relentless rhythm of the waves, was more terrifying than any shriek of the damned. It was the silence of survivors, the silence of profound loss and enduring trauma. Thorn remained surprisingly functional. The madness that had possessed him seemed to have dissipated, leaving him with a hollow but alert presence. His knowledge of seamanship, unexpectedly practical after the ordeal, proved invaluable in adjusting the sails, catching the erratic breezes, and guiding them through the treacherous waters. He spoke little, his gaze distant, as if still trapped within the labyrinthine corridors of the cursed vessel. Days bled into nights, each sunrise a fragile hope, each sunset a reminder of their isolation. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking their skin, and the nights brought chilling winds and the constant threat of hypothermia. Their meager supplies dwindled, their rations stretching thinner with each passing day. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, but the gnawing fear within was far more potent. The sea, once their home, now felt like an implacable enemy, an unforgiving expanse of water and sky. They encountered no other vessels, their pleas for help lost to the vastness of the ocean. The radio remained stubbornly silent, a cruel mockery of their desperate hopes for rescue. They were alone, utterly alone, adrift in a sea of their own making. As the days passed, a strange quiet descended upon them. It was not the terrifying silence of the derelict ship, but a weary acceptance of their fate. They spoke less, their conversations limited to the necessities of survival, the rationing of food, the adjustment of sails, the constant bailing. The shared trauma had forged an unspoken bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, Thorn pointed towards the distance. A faint smudge on the horizon, barely visible, but a smudge nonetheless. Hope, fragile and flickering, ignited anew within them. It was a ship, a distant silhouette against the dying light, a beacon of rescue in the vast emptiness of the ocean. They waved frantically, their cries carried away by the wind, but somehow their desperate pleas reached their destination. The ship altered its course, its lights growing stronger, larger, until it appeared as a benevolent giant looming over their tiny craft. Rescue came in the form of a freighter, its crew weary but kind, their faces etched with surprise at the sight of 3 gaunt, exhausted men in a battered lifeboat, far from any known shipping lane. They were brought aboard, their ordeal finally over, the nightmare seemingly concluded. But the aftermath proved far more insidious than any encounter with Dagon. Finn, plagued by vivid nightmares, relived the grotesque visions from the ritual, his once steady hands trembling uncontrollably. He spoke of the sacrifice, the twisted forms of the damned, his words fractured, his sanity frayed at the edges. Silas, outwardly strong, battled a pervasive sense of guilt, the weight of responsibility for leading them into such a harrowing adventure. The obsidian shard, now safely stowed away, remained a chilling reminder of the power they had unleashed and barely survived. The chilling silence of the ship, the relentless waves, the cold isolation, they all haunted his waking hours. He couldn't shake off the sense of something lingering, something unseen, something that followed them from the depths of the ocean. Thorn, despite his initial composure, succumbed to a deep, pervasive melancholia. He spoke little, withdrawing further into himself, his eyes holding a faraway gaze, as if still searching the endless horizon, searching for something lost, something irretrievably gone. The freighter deposited them in the nearest port, a small coastal town that held little comfort. The authorities, baffled by their tale of a derelict ship, a cosmic horror, and a ritual of unimaginable cruelty, dismissed their story as the ravings of 3 men driven mad by exposure and starvation. Their harrowing experience, the horrors they had witnessed, seemed to lack any tangible evidence, leaving their tales swallowed by the skepticism and indifference of the land. They parted ways, each man carrying the invisible scars of their ordeal. The ocean's vastness, once a symbol of freedom, now haunted their dreams, a relentless reminder of the terror they had barely escaped. But the unanswered questions remained, lingering like a phantom pain. What was the true nature of the derelict ship? What dark secrets did it guard within its decaying hull? What was the purpose of Dagon's ritual, and what was the legacy it left behind? The answers, shrouded in the mists of the ocean's depth, remained elusive, a haunting testament to the unseen horrors that dwell beyond the ken of human comprehension. The sea, they knew, held its mysteries close, and some secrets, some horrors, are better left undisturbed, buried beneath the relentless waves, lost to the fathomless depths. Their escape was a victory, but a victory stained with the indelible mark of trauma, a lingering reminder that the sea's depths hold more than just water. They had escaped the sea's immediate clutches, but the sea, in its ethereal essence, had claimed a piece of their souls. The ocean remained their constant companion, a constant reminder of their harrowing journey, a journey from which they would never truly return. Chapter 16: Lingering Shadows. The port town of Oakhaven offered little solace. The salty air, once a symbol of freedom, now carried the stench of damp earth and decaying fish, a smell that clung to Finn like a shroud. He found a room in a ramshackle inn overlooking the harbor, the rhythmic creak of the aged timbers, a constant, unsettling echo of the derelict vessel. Sleep offered no escape. Instead, it plunged him deeper into the abyss of his nightmares. A relentless replay of the ritual, the grotesque chanting, the sight of Thorn's contorted face as the obsidian shard pierced his flesh. The faces of the drowned, their eyes wide and accusing, haunted his waking moments, their silent screams echoing in the empty spaces of his mind. His hands, once steady and capable, now trembled uncontrollably, his touch hesitant and weak. He found himself avoiding mirrors, fearing the reflection of a broken man staring back. The authorities, he discovered, were uninterested in their tale. Their descriptions of the ship, the ritual, the creature they'd glimpsed, were dismissed as the ravings of men pushed to the brink of madness by exposure and starvation. Their ordeal was reduced to a footnote in a police report, a bizarre incident to be quickly forgotten. Silas, outwardly composed, held a different kind of torment. His guilt was a suffocating blanket, weighing down on his spirit. He had been the leader, the one who had lured them onto the cursed ship, the one who had been privy to Thorn's cryptic warnings. He replayed every decision, every missed chance, every moment of reckless ambition that had led them to the brink of oblivion. He carried the weight of their shared trauma, the burden of their near-death experience. He clutched the obsidian shard, now safely hidden within his worn sea bag, a dark obsidian reminder of the unholy power they had encountered. It was cold to the touch, an icy weight against his skin, and its chilling presence mirrored the frost of fear that settled deep within his soul. The silence of the ship, the crushing weight of the waves, the unrelenting cold, they were not mere memories but physical sensations, phantom pains that gnawed at his insides. He saw Dagon's reflection in every dark pool, felt its presence in the ebb and flow of the ocean's tide, its malevolent energy radiating through the waves and invading his dreams. He tried to find solace in the routine of daily life, but the ocean's haunting presence followed him even on land, a constant undertow pulling him back into the depths of his trauma. Thorn, the quietest of the three, seemed to have retreated entirely into himself. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, now held a vacant stare, their depths clouded by an impenetrable melancholy. He spoke little, his answers brief and detached, as if he were observing the world from a great distance, his thoughts adrift on a sea of despair. He showed no outward signs of his internal turmoil, maintaining a stoic silence, punctuated only by the occasional sigh or the distant, unfocused stare out to the unrelenting ocean. He spent his days wandering the outskirts of Oakhaven, avoiding human contact, his gaze perpetually fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something lost, something beyond retrieval. His silence was more chilling than any scream, his vacant gaze more unsettling than any terrifying vision. He seemed to be carrying the weight of something far larger, far more dreadful than his companions could ever comprehend. He'd become a shell, emptied by the horrors he had witnessed, his spirit lost in the boundless expanse of the ocean. The nights were the worst. In the quiet of his room, Finn would be overcome with a wave of terror, gasping for air as the phantoms of the ship's depths materialized before his eyes. Silas would lie awake, listening to the distant murmur of the waves, the unseen currents seeming to whisper warnings. Thorn would simply sit by the window, staring into the darkness, his presence a palpable weight in the room, a ghost adrift in his own memories. The ocean, once a source of wonder and adventure, had become their shared nightmare, its invisible tendrils weaving through their lives, binding them together in a silent pact of shared trauma. They tried to speak, to share their burdens, but words failed them. Their experiences too profound, too disturbing for language to encompass. Their camaraderie, forged in the crucible of survival, was strained by the invisible chains of their respective torments. They were bound by a shared experience, yet isolated by the particularity of their own suffering. The questions remained, haunting them like restless spirits. What was the true nature of the derelict ship? Was it merely a vessel lost at sea, or something more sinister, a gateway to another realm? What was the purpose of Dagon's ritual? What entity or force had it invoked? And what were the consequences of its completion? The obsidian shard, a tangible piece of the horror, offered no answers, its polished surface reflecting only the tormented faces of its keepers. The authorities dismissed their accounts, their skepticism a chilling reflection of humanity's willful ignorance of the unseen horrors that lurked beneath the waves. Their tale, deemed unbelievable, was left to fade into obscurity, swallowed by the indifference of a world unwilling to acknowledge the terrifying truths that existed beyond the veil of reality. Their escape had been a victory of sorts, a survival against overwhelming odds. But the victory was bittersweet, laced with the pervasive taste of trauma, a relentless reminder of the ocean's terrifying power, of its ability to consume not just the body but the soul. The sea's relentless grip, once loosened, had subtly altered their lives, its intangible influence permeating every facet of their existence. They had returned from the depths, but a part of them remained lost, adrift in the ethereal realm of memory, forever haunted by the chilling enigma of the derelict vessel, the horrifying ritual, and the unspeakable horror that had lurked just beyond human comprehension. The ocean's silence, once peaceful and comforting, now whispered dark secrets, echoing the chilling reality that some doors are better left unopened, some mysteries best left undisturbed in the unfathomable depths of the sea, where the horrors of the abyss remain forever concealed beneath the waves. The unanswered questions, like the ocean itself, stretched on endlessly, a testament to the vast, terrifying unknown that lay beyond the limits of human perception and comprehension. Their ordeal, a horrifying odyssey into the abyss, had left them forever changed, bound together by invisible threads of trauma, forever marked by the lingering shadows of the sea.